Welcome everyone for attending this webinar on YouTube to mark the 4th June Tiananmen Massacre, which happened exactly 31 years ago in 1989 in Beijing, China. Today's event is hosted by the Hong Kong Committee, Norway, together with Norwegian Tibet Committee, the Norwegian Uyghur Committee. I'm Jessica from the Hong Kong Committee, Norway. This webinar will last for about 1 hour. It will start with a short video with the annual Tiananmen Remembrance events in Hong Kong, as well as pictures with supporting messages sent from people around here in Norway. The video is accompanied by a song in Cantonese called Flower of Freedom, which people in Hong Kong sing every year on the 4th June Remembrance Assemblies. After the video, we'll observe an 1-minute silence to the Tiananmen victims. After that, sinologist Harald Bøckman from Norway and Tiananmen survivor Rose Tang will do a sharing about the Tiananmen Massacre. Due to limited time, we unfortunately do not have the opportunity for Q&A with our speakers today, but you're welcome to leave comments on this YouTube live video.
會死，記着吧。無論雨怎麼打，自由仍是會開花。但有一個夢不會死，記着吧。來自你我的心，記着吧。但有一個夢不會死，記着吧。無論雨怎麼打，自由仍是會開花。但有一個夢不會死，記着吧。來自你我的心，記着吧。
Yeah. So today we have Harald and Rose to be our guest speakers. I'll first introduce Harald. Harald is a Norwegian researcher at the Center for Development and Environment at the University of Oslo. He's a sinologist, considered also as an expert in Chinese language, culture, history, and politics. And he's also the coordinator of the Asian Studies Network. So today Harald is also a member of the China's guest speaker in Norwegian. I will first introduce. He will first tell us the background of what happened in 1989.
The Tiananmen Square has a very special position in China's history. Here in this painting from the Qing dynasty, which should have a slightly different size, but in a way it shows the front of the Forbidden City with the imperial quarters behind. The front was, one could say, the most public-like space in China at the time, where promulgations were announced. And what you also will see, or could see on this picture, is that once you take a look at the imperial quarters, they're more, they disappear. They are more hidden in mist, which is very symbolic for the function it had. But also in modern time, and especially so during the first nationalist movement in China, in the wake of the First World War, so-called May 4th movement, which is named after this demonstration, which you see here, on the May the 4th, in front of the Tiananmen Square, or the gate, rather. So it has a long history, which comes much earlier than the event we are going to talk more about today, the Liu Si, the June 4th massacre. And after 49,
which you see here,
China's
in front
took power, one of the first things they did was to expand the square, because the square wasn't that big.
It has
And here you see
which
the first efforts from the early 50s, an ever-expanding breakup of the old imperial structure. Those of you who have been to China can see the outline already there. And the picture below, you see how it was then when it was finished in the late 50s. And from then on, it has continued to have an ever-increasing symbolic political significance in Chinese history, and it certainly had so in those dramatic days in May and June 1989. If we move on, you will see examples of political rallies, but of course these were all organized and orchestrated strictly by the communists, but at the same time it was also used on certain occasions later on as a place of protest. For example, in 1976, when Premier Zhou Enlai died, there was a spontaneous reaction of sending wreaths and reading poems in memory of the prime minister, who was much respected by most Chinese. But if we move on, you'll see that on the 15th of August 1989, the then leader of the Chinese Communist Party, Hu Yaobang, he died. And there arose, also on the Tiananmen Square, a spontaneous commemoration with wreaths, with speeches. And this is not the place where this takes place is not just any old place. It's the monumental revolutionary heroes right at the middle of the square. And this, which started as a spontaneous demonstration, grew to something that we had never seen before in the history of the People's Republic, and probably not since the May 4th, 1919. Because people, one could say they voted, or they gave their opinion with their feet, as we say. That means they started marching more and more spontaneously, and then gradually more semi-organized. The ones who were spearheading these movements were students from various universities and institutes of higher learning in Beijing. This has been brewing since 1986. Students had been a strong force in demanding more rights, mainly rights of expression and even rights to vote in some cases. But it was in 1989, it was also a grievance because of the increasing insecurity that the reforms had resulted in. You had inflation, people were more worried about their work, more, you could say, symbols of a society that is modernizing, but is also producing new contradictions. So this was a movement that started as a student movement, but then it spread. And there were more and more people taking part. Like you see on this picture, these are people from the official weekly magazine, Beijing Zhoubao, Beijing Review, which some of you may remember. So this was unprecedented. The people within the official institutions in the capital started marching and demanding rights and protesting the conditions that were at the time. And they were not the only ones, there were more. And this scared the leadership, scared them, I could use stronger words, but they didn't know how to handle this. So first they started sending in police. And this picture is rather unique. You see the police cheering the people who are protesting on the sidewalk. This was early in May, and the mood was going to change. So at the outset, this was like a liberating moment, and some people have, actually many people, and those who were there, said it was like a Woodstock festival. Dancing, singing, thinking all kinds of incredible thoughts, which they had not been thinking of before. But it was also a time of worry, fatigue, insecurity, wondering where is this going to leave us or lead us, as you can see on this picture. And after repeated demonstrations, after other kind of strategic moves, like initiating a hunger strike, like you see here, among others, by the one who's lying down, that is one of the student leader, the Uyghur who's also known as War Kaishi. And this is a very iconic picture, because here is the prime minister, the very, very unpopular prime minister Li Peng. He actually pays a symbolic visit to these students. But his intention was clearly not to meet them halfway. His intention was how to start controlling the movement. And Li Peng, as you may know, he ended up as the butcher of the Beijing massacre. And from then on, it became more sinister. Here, the then party leader who took over after Huibang, Zhao Ziyang, one afternoon he came down on the square, he grabbed his microphone, or megaphone, and he told the students, "I'm sorry, I come too late." Why did he say that? He said that because he knew that the party leadership had decided to crack down on the movement. But that didn't stop the students from coming up with new creative initiatives. Here is a work in progress, you can say, by the students from the arts, what's the name of it? Is an institute, I guess, Harald Institute of Creative Arts. They are about to make a big statue called the Statue of Freedom. And as you will see, the model was clearly the Statue of Liberty in New York. And she's facing and in a way defying the image of Mao Zedong, which had been hanging on the Tiananmen gatehouse. But the Statue of Freedom, she had the torch, but she had forgotten the books, the law books. And this is perhaps a little symbolic for the movement, that they didn't know which books to go by. And that's perhaps one of the good signs of the movement, but it was also part of the problem with the movement. Anyway, the elders, and when I say elders, you can see these people sitting here. These are mostly octogenarians, and some of them were not any longer part of the formal party leadership, but they still met in the house with old Deng Xiaoping, who's sitting in the middle, to decide on the crackdown. And the executor was Li Peng, the prime minister. So here it is, those who decided the fate of China for many decades to come. And the military build-up continued. You see not just military build-up, but you also see people in the streets. People, and then the mood was getting bad, getting vicious, getting angry, more and more. So the first encounters, which were more positive, they became much more serious as time went on. People pleaded with the soldiers, but you see, they were kind of, as they say in Chinese, 不好意思. They were feeling kind of, uncomfortable with the situation. Many of them were young boys, soldiers, probably from the countryside, who would be more amenable for taking up such a terrible job to crush a popular uprising. And the people responded. They built barricades. They kind of understood what was coming in order to block the entrances to the Tiananmen Square, where the thousands and the students and the supporters were still holding out. But then, in the night of the 4th of June, then the attack came, and that was lethal. The tanks just making their way through human bodies to make it to the square, to clean the square. And people were just reacting spontaneously, driving dead, wounded to the hospitals. The hospitals of Beijing were flooded with dead and wounded. There's no exact number how many people died or laid down their life, but it runs in the high hundreds and perhaps more than 1,000. And these are pictures which you not very much like to see, but that's how hospitals in Beijing were during that night. Then the day after, you see the square. It's been cleaned, it's being cleaned. There's tanks, there's people, soldiers running around. And then you see this long parade of tanks coming. But if you look at the very, very lowest left corner, there's a small figure, a man with a white shirt. I hope you can see it, right? And who's this one? What's happening? And this is the other, or the most iconic picture from this event. This has been used by the international press to show that people were stopping the tanks. But actually it's not, because tanks came in the night. This is the day after. So there's another kind of heroism here. There's this one man, he's out with his plastic bags, maybe he has been shopping, and he's just so furious, he wants to stop the tanks going with his own body. The tanks try to go where left, he goes left, and goes right, he goes right. This was taken by an American photographer who was in the Beijing hotel nearby. Eventually, he even climbs up to on the tank, trying to talk the soldiers on board to stop or to turn around, but he doesn't succeed. And he finally then, there he climbs up, and then he finally is dragged away by people who were watching the dramatic thing. And so he wasn't run down, but he hasn't been identified later on, I think, or maybe somebody else knows his whereabouts, but he probably paid a high price for this very, very daring one-person act. So with that, the tragedy of the night until June the 4th came to an end. And that's already 32 years ago, 31 years ago. But fortunately, there are not just survivors, but also participants who are willing to voice their opinion and tell us their story. So, Rose Tang.
Thanks for our informative presentation. Hi, Rose. Thank you for joining us on this very special day. Rose is based in New York. She was a student protester in Tiananmen in 1989. From her survival from the massacre, she has become an activist, campaigning for human rights now in the US. She is currently also a writer and musician. Welcome, Rose, today. Would you like to tell us more about yourself and your stories in 1989?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Thank you so much. I have 10 minutes. I have 10 minutes, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for hosting this meaningful event. And thank you, Professor Bøckman. This year is particularly significant because the Hong Kong government has banned the commemoration of Tiananmen. But people of Hong Kong, I'm so amazed. I mean, no, I was just watching some live footage and tweets about the commemorations in Hong Kong in several sites, Mong Kok, Tuen Mun, and Tiananmen, sorry, not Tiananmen, Victoria Park. And the police, plainclothes police, they are manhandling the mourners, and people are very peaceful, but they are being subdued with violence. This is a stark contrast to a year ago in Hong Kong, when more than 200,000 people showed up in Victoria Park. This year, in 31 years, it's the first time it's been banned, thanks to the mandate from the Chinese government, Beijing, banning Hong Kong and Macau. Before, Hong Kong and Macau, especially Hong Kong, was the only place under Chinese government's rule that when people could legally commemorating Tiananmen. And I thank Hong Kongers very, very much for that. I'm very, very grateful, especially Hong Kongers' support throughout the years, even before '89, to the pro-democracy movement in China, not just with donations, but with manpower, with rescue operations afterwards, after the massacre. So for myself in 1989, I was a freshman majoring English in Beijing Second Foreign Languages Institute. And I wasn't very interested in politics for a long time. I was very cynical because both of my parents and my grandparents on both sides were persecuted for years, for more than a decade in the Cultural Revolution. And my father, who was jailed for editing a student's journal, he was jailed and persecuted for 11 years. He always warned me, politics is dangerous. But to me, before Tiananmen, politics meant brainwashing, so it was boring to me. I remember when Hu Yaobang died, on the day of his funeral in late April, I happened to be shopping in Tiananmen, near Tiananmen Square. I saw tens of thousands of people gathering in Tiananmen Square in front of the Great Hall of the People. Most of the people there, standing or sitting on the ground, were students. And behind them were thousands of armed police. I could see this sea of black and green. Black, it was the people's clothes and hair and heads, and the green was the green uniform of thousands of armed police. That was my first time to see that many police in Beijing. And on top of the stairs in front of the Great Hall of the People, there were 3 students on their knees. The student in the middle was holding a huge scroll of paper, and I was told they were petitioning. They had 7 demands, I think, petitioning and asking the government to come and take that scroll. And I remembered I really disliked the scene because kneeling in front of the authorities reminded me of thousands of years kind of tradition or customs a custom in China when there was injustice, when people had grievances. All they could do was kowtowing, go on their knees, kneel down in front of a governor or the emperor, and petitioning. It's like, to me, it's like begging. So I went back to the campus, but I started to get curious about what was going on. Of course, I heard about Hu Yaobang's reputation of being a Qingguan. Qingguan means uncorrupted official. He was one of the very rare uncorrupted Chinese Communist Party officials, top officials at the time. And he was seen as a tragic figure because he was sidelined as a reformer and he had a heart attack. So people were mourning. But I still wasn't that interested until we started boycotting classes. I never liked going to classes, so I fully supported that. As I was, yay, no more classes. Then, of course, we started to have marches to Tiananmen Square, and started with rallies on campus. Then we started marching to Tiananmen Square almost on a daily basis. I marched with other students, and I still did not quite understand what was going on. And I was aware student leader like Wang Dan had been organizing this Minju Salon, democracy salon, so-called salon, but really just like gatherings of groups of people listening to some professor or student talking about democracy on the campus of Peking University. And they were working, the students were working with physicists and the vice president of Zhongguo Keji Da, China Science and Technology University, Fang Lizhi, and his wife Li Shuxian, who were very vocal about political reforms and introducing democracy to China. As the days went by, more and more marches, and the turning point for the movement and to myself was the hunger strike. I think was in May, early to mid-May. The hunger strike wasn't really agreed upon by all the student leaders, but it still went on. And the hunger strike, I do not agree with such a form of protesting since then and still now. But the hunger strike was effective because people literally was holding placards in Tiananmen Square announcing it's been 24 hours since the hunger strikes began. Where's the government? They got to hear us. Then, in a few hours will be more countdowns. And the next day, I remember people were getting more and more frustrated and angry. So I went to Tiananmen Square more often, and I volunteered to be on the picket line, standing in the blazing sun. It was getting hot. And next to those shelters, temporary shelters and tents set up for the hunger strikers. We're there all day long. It was really hard work. And shouting slogans and trying to coordinate the traffic because there are ambulances going through the crowds to attend to the hunger strikers. I remember that time more and more people were talking about millions of people started to pour into streets. And of course, as Professor Bøckman was mentioning, and thank you so much for showing us all those archival photos of Tiananmen Square back then. During May 4th movement, Tiananmen Square was the epicenter of May 4th movement, and 1989 happened to be the 70th anniversary of May 4th movement, which was a youth-led movement. And the goal of the movement was to introduce democracy and science, and mainly the stuff from the West into China. That was a historical event. Even in our brainwashing, patriotic education was emphasized on as a patriotic movement. So on May 4th already, there were millions of people. Lots and lots of people. That was the highest number of people in the streets in Beijing. I remembered I marched from my university, which was down the eastern suburbs near Tongzhou, all the way to Tiananmen. That was at least 25 or if not 30 kilometers to Tiananmen Square. Then we rallied in Tiananmen Square. Then we marched down to Peking University, which is on the northwestern side, outskirts of Beijing. So overall, we walked at least 100 kilometers that day on May 4th. So the momentum was already going from May 4th. Then the hunger strike, the tensions were going higher and higher every day because people really could not understand where's the government. And I remember sometimes the CCTV, the top mouthpiece, was just blank. And some newspapers, their newspapers, started to show photos of the hunger strike and the people's demonstrations. And in the square, and the square started to become a world by itself, unto itself. It was like a utopia because with the hunger strikers and the supporters of hunger strikers, the picket line members and other demonstrators, day in, day out, day and night, and somehow it became very organic. Hong Kong protests last year and in Umbrella Revolution in 2014 reminded me of that. It was like Tiananmen. It became a very efficient society governed by protesters and students themselves, various organizations, and sometimes just spontaneous gatherings. And every night and every day, there were spontaneous forums in many streets of Beijing, not just Tiananmen, mainly in Tiananmen. It's like whatever you want to say, if you're loud enough, you stand in Tiananmen Square, you say something, and people will gather and listen very carefully and discuss and debate. And some people will take turns and sing songs and shout slogans. And it was this incredible camaraderie going on among people because people were helping one another. And families brought little kids out, people from all age groups and all walks of life all came out. I remember singing a lot of monks and nuns, with their fists in the airs and shouting slogans with us, and supporting us. And they were donating food and drinks and bottles of water and Coca-Cola and soft drinks. And I remember lots of bags of bread and crackers being passed around. And there were even rolls of film. Back then, no digital cameras, so analog cameras. So rolls of films were handed out to those who have cameras. And even the policemen, they came out marching in their uniforms. And then Beijing residents came out marching, holding their ID cards and demanding justice and demanding the government to have a dialogue with us. Mind you, having a dialogue with the masses, with people, was actually suggested by Zhao Ziyang, the general secretary of Chinese Communist Party back then, before he was the premier, who's a known reformist. He was the one who was suggesting the party, the government officials should have dialogues with people. So actually the students and the civilians, the residents who were demanding a dialogue with the government were merely going along, shall I say, party policy. But then again, ironically, it is just like many things in China. There's a lot of absurdity and irony. So ironically, the government that suggested the dialogue with the people, when the people came out and, either on their knees or by hunger strike or all sorts of peaceful, may I say, very peaceful, innovative ways of demanding a dialogue or asking for a dialogue, and the government officials were nowhere to be seen. So I think it was very stupid of the government to do that. Now I understand it's because the Chinese Communist Party cannot tolerate any dissent, does not know how to deal with dissent, rather than use propaganda and violence, state violence, right? Violent crackdowns on, Hong Kong, Tibet, East Turkestan, China, Tiananmen. So the situation was escalating, but the propaganda later and even during was blaming the students for escalating the tensions. It's like the attitude is like, you're a bunch of unruly kids and you're there demanding this and that, and get real, like who's in charge, right? But at that time, it was the first time for the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, seemingly very powerful, almighty, almost like God in China, or kind of God in China, showing how weak, how scared it was, because it was silent, right? I mean, if you don't like us doing something, say something. Of course, back then, remember the 426 社论, April 26th, editorial in People's Daily. And a little bit of background, People's Daily usually is the sort of like the White House press office. So whatever Mao Zedong wanted to have to start a political campaign, he would even personally write editorials to be published on front page of People's Daily, the top CCP, Chinese Communist Party mouthpiece. So that was the case. So on the 26th of April, the editorial in People's Daily clearly branded the movement as 动乱, that's turmoil, almost like riot. It's a very vague Chinese term, but really means upheaval, uprising, and turmoil. Nothing good. So I heard even back then, people were warning, so, be careful, they have 定性, they have already defined the movement. So people who have been through the Cultural Revolution warned us, the crackdowns are coming. But of course, as I described before, more and more people poured into the streets. So don't blame the students for escalating the tensions. It was the government that escalated the tensions by branding us of being causing the turmoil. So
Rose, can I interrupt a little? I'm sorry, because there's always this tyranny of time.
Yes, sorry,
Could
yeah.
you move towards the June the 4th?
Yeah.
I know you're it's a wonderful witness, but it's the issue of time that is.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So many details, right? Anyway, very complex too. So anyway, so during the hunger strike, then was Gorbachev's historical visit to China. Right. And the students, so the government was still planning to having a very grandeur and very, very grand welcome ceremony. It was not able to do that. The students were occupying the square. We started the Occupy movement back in Tiananmen, not Wall Street. So Gorbachev, so the Chinese government had to welcome him to have the welcome reception at the airport. And many people noticed on national TV, it was live broadcast on national TV. They were so hastily prepared the ceremony. There was even no red carpet. And people were laughing. It's like, what? They're panicking. So then to raise more awareness of the movement, to publicize Chinese government's embarrassment even more, there were top anchors from all the major TV networks around the world, and the top correspondents that are all in Beijing covering the summit. But some of them said they ended up walking to revolution. So the spirit was high, but later on, towards the end of May, the movement started to dwindle a bit. People started to be a bit confused because we cannot shout slogans all the time. The hunger strike was called off later on, and people got a bit confused. But later on, in late May, early June, the erection in the square of the statue, the Goddess of Democracy, it welcomed another wave of the movement. But the martial law was declared on May 20th, and the armed police started to beat up students in various parts of Beijing, including some of my friends in my university. I went to Xinhuamen, the front gate of Zhongnanhai, the top leadership compound, and I ended up leading an all-night sit-in defying. So everybody was defying the martial law. The civilians, especially Beijing's residents, successfully managed to block the military trucks from entering Beijing. That was extraordinary. A lot of similar tankman situations there. People stood or even lied in front of tanks and military trucks. Until the 3rd of June, the afternoon, then there were more military trucks rolling in, and people started to set up roadblocks using traffic blocks. That's when I blocked military trucks outside my campus, because that was the road outside the campus was the major road leading into Beijing from the east. So there were dozens and dozens. We stopped dozens of military trucks from coming in, going to square. And I decided, I was told that there were very few students in the square. So I decided to go into square, and I took a Uyghur dagger, my collection of artistic collection. I never used a knife or violence. So I dressed in black and wore a red hairband. I cycled all the way to square. And once I entered Jianguomenwai Avenue, and it was like entering a war zone, a lot of burning trucks and buses. People were putting traffic blocks as roadblocks, blocking the avenue of eternal peace, Chang'anjie. Once I got into the square, it was really peaceful. There were a lot of families there, even street vendors selling food. And students had no weapons, and we're trying to make Molotov cocktails. We didn't know what to do. we're preparing for tear gas. So we're handing out handkerchiefs and cloths, asking people to use water to wet the cloths to cover the mouth, and nobody had experience in dealing with tear gas. We were prepared for tear gas and rubber bullets, until when they shot at us above the square, we saw all these bullets going everywhere. We had to sit down for a few hours in the middle of the night. We saw all these bullets and we heard all this noise. It's like somebody banging on garbage cans or firecrackers. We thought they were firecrackers, but they were live ammunition. We realized that when we saw wounded students being carried into the square, the bloodstained shirts brought in by other students, and telling us the killings were going on all around us. We're in the eye of the storm. So thanks to the late Liu Xiaobo, and you're in Oslo, so Liu Xiaobo won Nobel Peace Prize. I think, of course, for other things he did, but that was amazing. He saved our lives. He and 3 other older hunger strikers, Taiwanese pop singer Ho De-jian, went to negotiate with an army captain to let us so-called peacefully retreat from the square. But then, of course, it wasn't peaceful. The tanks had already rolled in, surrounded with us, with the foot soldiers, with the big sticks with them. So the so-called peaceful retreating was only for a few minutes, for photo ops, for propaganda. Very quickly, they started to beat us up, and I was beaten up, and it was a stampede because nobody wanted to be beaten up. So people were scrambling all over the place trying to escape. I had to crawl. I had to stumble. I stumbled over several bodies. I did not know if they were alive or dead, but the bodies were not moving. And when I was caught by this stampede, I was caught between a stampede and a tank without thinking, because when you need to survive, you don't think. But everything was in slow motion. So I crawled over the tank under the gun barrel, machine gun barrel of the barrel of the soldier. I could see the soldier's face and his helmet. His head was sticking out of that tank. And I managed to get out and gather other students. And I hitchhiked with another student leader back to the campus. We called an ambulance. Then with the ambulance, we attempted to go through Chang'an Avenue. Of course, it was blocked. It was very violent. Still a lot of killings and shootings going on. We had to go through a lot of little lanes and outskirts, and we managed to rescue the students, 24 students from our campus, back to our campus.
Rose, this is a very, very valuable testimony. You know, when time is moving, the details are disappearing, but exactly because of that, it's very, very important what you have been sharing with us. But I think we also would like, since it's a special day, and you've already mentioned Hong Kong, perhaps if you could make some comments. I know you have been living in Hong Kong also. I mean, in your life as a migrant around various places. So if you could, on a day like this, you know, there are national security laws. They've been implemented in Xinjiang, in Tibet. They're already in place. Also special laws in Xinjiang. Now they want to have special laws for Hong Kong. What do you think will be the outcome? Or how do you reflect upon the predicament which Hong Kong finds it today? 5 minutes, as we say. in the news releases.
We've been worried about. I moved to Hong Kong from Australia when I was a journalist. A few months before the June 1st handover in 1997, and my goal was to witness history in the making. and to cover it as well as a journalist. I remember back then I was feeling very sad for Hong Kong, and some Hong Kongers were still very naive and hopeful. Some older ones I spoke to who escaped China in the 50s, 60s, and they were really dismayed, and they're feeling very sad and a bit confused as well, because I knew there was this distrust of the CCP. And of course, it's all legitimate. We should not trust such a violent organization. I call the Chinese Communist Party the world's biggest terrorist organization, responsible for millions, tens of millions of deaths in China and Chinese occupied countries such as Tibet and East Turkestan and Southern Mongolia. And now Hong Kong, we've always been dreading Hong Kong would be made into another Chinese city, and which is their goal. The CCP's goal and tactics and strategies were straight from their Xinjiang, Tibet, East Turkestan textbooks, their policies, may I say, colonial policies, violent crackdown on dissent, lots of widespread persecution, destruction of the local culture, the language, and the local customs and traditions, mass migration of Chinese. So in Hong Kong, over the last few years, 150 migrants approved by Beijing, not by the Hong Kong immigration authorities, per day into Hong Kong for the last few years. So Hong Kong has already been slowly being a boiling frog in the cold water, and the infiltration and the encroachment of CCP and the encroachment of freedom has been turned up one notch, and culminating in 2014 Umbrella Revolution. That's when the Hong Kongers really showed the amazing, almost reminiscent of Tiananmen way of protesting and occupying Admiralty, Causeway Bay, and Mongkok, and a lot of parallels. And the crackdowns were different because the CCP has learned its lesson. Because Hong Kong is an open society, and being almost anything happening in Hong Kong protests were watched by in the full view of the world. Being live, I was always saying the revolution is being televised and live streamed, and especially last year, Hong Kong protests were the most live streamed mass protests, I think, in the world last year. And the Hong Kong, judging from Hong Kong people's resilience, because mind you, a lot of Hong Kong people are descendants of the refugees from China. Right. They're very determined, and their parents and grandparents or uncles have already, or aunts have already told them how vicious this regime is. And the Hong Kong people, a lot of the young people, especially the young protesters last year, they grew up after the handover. They were born after the handover. They were
1997, right?
Yes,
the handover.
They were very. They have a very stronger and clearer Hong Kong identity. It's undeniable, and they refuse, and they will not back down. And at the same time, CCP and Hong Kong government, the puppet government, they will not back down either. So it's going to get more bloody, and it's going to drag on for years and decades to come. But I'm very optimistic about Hong Kong, because judging from the Chinese Communist Party's editorials, propaganda, all those slandering, and their foreign ministry spokespeople, they're always talking about Hong Kong independence, separatism. This national security law specifically mentioned that secession and foreign interference.
And terrorism, I think.
Terrorism, but Hong Kong has already got an anti-terrorism law, so that's no excuse. The real terrorists are the government, the police, the riot police, and the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, right? But so anyway, the thing is, they really refuse to deal with people in the civilized world, but this is for the world to see too. So how are they going to convince the more multinationals and more government leaders around the world and people around the world who would dare to do business with Chinese government, right? Or trade negotiations? And look at the pandemics. This is what you will get. It's dangerous, not just dangerous, deadly, right? So, and Hong Kong is the stage for them to show, and they're really worried about color revolution. So Hong Kongers will keep pushing Hong Kong independence, which is what I support as well. I support Tibet independence, East Turkestan independence, Southern Mongolia independence, because this is in line with Chinese history too.
I'm very happy to hear you saying that, but how many Chinese in China do you think will follow you on that line about the independence for the outlying areas of the former empire?
Their voices are getting stronger. A few years ago, when I was a lone voice, or one of the rare lone voices talking about independence, because I first came out supporting in Tibetan independence and East Turkestan, Southern Mongolian independence. Plus, I'm part Mongol. Of course, I support Southern Mongolian independence. And also, when you look at Chinese history, it's never like one big dynasty for 5,000 years. No, it's a joke. It's not. And so it could be the future. So they're now even like a Shanghai Independence Party organized by the mainland Chinese. And I see tweets from people inside China, even calling out for Canton independence, for independence, about Hunan. It's deeply ingrained in Chinese culture. Look at different languages. They're not dialects. Different cuisines. And people are like, you're from Beijing? No, I'm from Tianjin. You're from Chongqing? I hate Chongqing people. I'm from Chengdu. It's a lot of those local identities being suppressed for so long. So,
now we're into fancy dreams about China's future. Could a federation be a solution, or does that go against the idea about a unified kingdom? How do you think?
Well, even my parents' generations, those people who have been through the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, they were talking about United States of China. I'm talking about in the 80s, people were talking about Federation of China, United States of China. There are a lot of debates going on in the 80s, early 80s already. So people, the silent majority are still thinking. They're not real dumb slaves. When time is ready, I am optimistic. People, of course, they are pragmatic. They're being encouraged by the government to be materialistic. But look at people leaving China, sending their kids overseas, and even the Chinese top CCP officials, like siphoning off their assets, the robbed from the people overseas, sending their family members overseas. So, they've been jumping off the sinking ship. They themselves don't even have much, how can I say, confidence in China, right?
Well, we may be entering into the land of utopias here, but certainly this could also accommodate Taiwan, possibly, if you're talking about a federation. But as for the Thai now, I think it's the Hong Kong people who have to devise methods which somehow can make them survive, and also show them that there could be alternatives that will not lead to a tragic end.
Let's hope so.
Yeah.
I'm not religious, but I pray. I really cannot see more losses of lives. Too much. It's been too many. 15 of my relatives have perished on natural deaths under this regime. 13 of them starved to death. No, 12 of them starved to death. One committed suicide. 2 were executed for owning properties, a house or land or something. This is just one family. So,
okay, I think even if we don't like to, everything has to come to an end. And I think it's Jessica who has been the moderator here who will get the last word. But I certainly thank you. I've learned a lot from you as a living witness. I'm just a bookish person. So thank you from my side. And Jessica, please.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Yeah, thanks everyone for the YouTube Live and the webinar. Thank you, Harald, for joining us as a speaker in New York. Time's running out now, unfortunately, but the conversation was very insightful. And thank you, everyone, from contributing the photos to our video. The video is now published, so you can just follow our YouTube channel, then you can see again the video. It's a very nice song, I like it a lot. Well, the 1989 Tiananmen Massacre is an incident that we should never forget. And I hope one day we'll be able to see a freer and more democratic China, and that the truth can be discussed by the people in China and be told by generations there. Thanks for watching. See you in another chance. Bye.
thank you. This is the victory sign from Tiananmen.